Take a look at the screen, and this is probably not the image that you expected to see, but our goal for today is to simply discuss and think about the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Today in class, we spent a lot of time talking about the compromises, and the compromises are key to getting the document introduced to the people for ratification, introduced to the states, especially the leaders of the states, for ratification. But in order to get them to ratify it, it had to be explained not only to the leaders but to the people. I'm going to give you two people who I think are essential to understanding ratification of the Constitution. Number one is James Madison, and number two is Alexander Hamilton. And you can say a close third would be George Washington. And let me explain why each of those guys are pivotal. We'll start with George Washington. The fact that he's at the Constitutional Convention, and I'm pretty sure I would have mentioned this in class today, but the fact that he's in the Constitutional Convention, that he's there, lends it credibility. The people trust him, so they kind of trust what he is helping to create. Hamilton and Madison are more so important because they are going to take up the task of writing a series of essays. They're known as the Federalist Papers. They're going to write this series of essays that try to explain to the people why this government is okay. Because one of the biggest fears of a lot of people who we'll call anti-federalists, right, the people who are against the new Constitution, is that it is going to create something like this, right? A big, scary monster that's going to, inflict its distant authority on the people of the United States, just like England had. And what Hamilton and Jefferson were going to try to explain is that you could view it as a monster, but they look at it as like this monster, a three-headed monster. And this three-headed monster, if it looks like this, could be quite scary. However, if it looks like this, it's a little less threatening. And you can just kind of see, this right away is a little difficult to follow. And this is what was the key to ratification of the U.S. Constitution, was the explanation that this new federal government, while it was technically going to be this distant authority over where the states had had their power, this new government was going to have a lot of checks and a lot of balance to the way that it functioned. So you could look at it as one government, but really within that one government would be an executive branch, a judicial branch, and a legislative branch, and each of them were going to be responsible to one another and for one another in certain areas. What they would argue, Hamilton and Hamilton and Madison, would be that this setup would never allow for this, because this requires all three heads to be operating together simultaneously and for the same objective. And they believed, Hamilton and Madison believed, that this setup would require them to almost be in competition with one another, almost to be working with, but also sometimes against one another, and that would limit the power of this federal government. And that's very important. So here's what the United States looked like, at about the time of the constitutional crisis, Shays' Rebellion, things like that. You have a pretty separate entity of states that are working kind of together, like you looked at in the Articles of Confederation. And what the Constitution was really asking these states to do was to give up their individual autonomy, their individual power, so that some new central government could gain some power, for all of the reasons that we explained that the Articles of Confederation had weaknesses. Now, what is going to be the key to ratification are these Federalist Papers that I just explained a minute ago, that go into these states, that write articles, that write essays to these states, explaining why the fear that they might have is unwarranted. A majority of the population were what we would call Federalists, people who supported this new Constitution. The reason that the majority of the people would be Federalists, you read in your book, hopefully towards the end of class today, is that they see the problems more so than they see the fears with a new distant authority. The problems of the current setup, the inability to tax, the inability to protect ourselves, things like that, outweigh some of the fears that they might have with a stronger central government. So when we look at this map, what I want you to see is that we have, obviously these states look a little bit different. So I'll flip to this map. When we look at these maps, what we see are, individual states that are going to voluntarily be asked, are going to be asked to voluntarily relinquish some of their power to this new central government. And that is really important, because it is a transfer of power. It's a willing and voluntary transfer of power from the state level to this new, what we'll call, federal level. And the idea is that the states aren't losing everything. And so I just want to take a look at, real quick, a diagram, and I've actually had it on a different presentation. And it's this diagram right here. So you may have seen this one in some of the other things that I've had on the website recently. Sorry, this is bleeding off the screen a little bit here, but really this is this is the key to what I want you to see. Let me try and resize it a little bit here. This is what they were selling, that the government that they were creating did not take away all the power of the state governments. All it did really was take the power of government, which would have previously really just been one circle. The state governments had all the power. You had this tiny little Articles of Confederation government that had some power, and they're just going to separate it out. And in theory, they're going to share the powers of government between the central government, which will be the federal government in Washington, D.C. eventually, and the state governments, which will be located in the individual state capitals. And there will be specific powers that the central government will have. There will be specific powers that the state governments will have, and there will be some things that overlap. Also, there will be some things that neither can do. We'll talk about those in a little bit here. And so when we look at the ratification process, we have the states that have to ratify. It's different than the Articles of Confederation, because they only had to get to a smaller number. They had to have 7 out of 13, and once they get to that number, technically the government will take over. Now, what I would like to point out, and this is the last point that I want to make for this presentation, is that Hamilton and Madison are going to sell the people on the fact that divided powers of the government are going to create a less powerful central government. Plus, the reality that they're creating this new system of federalism really doesn't steal power from the states. Rather, it's just going to share power with this new central government from the states. And where we end up is we have this new government being presented to the states and to the people that is going to ask them, to share that power. And the biggest thing that was being complained about with the new Constitution was that it lacked a Bill of Rights. And this is something that we're going to stress, because the absence of the Bill of Rights, did it or could it hinder the ratification of the Constitution? And if it would, what would the Federalists do? And remember what a Federalist is. Those are people who were in favor of passing the new Constitution. If it isn't going to hinder the ratification, how are the Anti-Federalists going to accept that? What is their fear, and does it have a lot to do with what's in the Bill of Rights? So if you have questions about this, please feel free to shoot me an email.